"You're the first man who didn't hurt me," she whispered through cracked lips, her dark eyes reflecting years of betrayal and pain, but those words would cost them everything. In the unforgiving desert of 1887, Arizona Territory rancher Elias Ward found more than a dying Apache woman in that abandoned shack. He found a reason to live again. What started as an act of mercy would ignite a war with his own people, test the limits of human compassion, and forge an unbreakable bond between two broken souls. This is their story of surreal love and the courage to stand against hatred. Comment below what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story has traveled across the world. The desert wind carried death that October morning, howling across the scrubland like the breath of some ancient vengeful god. Elias Ward pulled his hat low against the stinging sand as he rode toward the abandoned mining shack, following the circling buzzards that had caught his eye from 3 miles out. At 42, he'd seen enough death in these badlands to know its calling cards: the patient birds, the stillness that felt wrong, the way even the wind seemed to pause in reverence. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Duchess, snorted nervously as they approached the weathered structure. The building leaned precariously against the desert floor, its wooden walls bleached white by years of sun and neglect. Broken bottles glinted like scattered diamonds around its perimeter, and a rusted pickaxe lay forgotten beside the door. "Easy, girl," Elias murmured, dismounting with the careful movements of a man whose bones had been broken too many times. His left leg, shattered by a Mustang's kick 5 years prior, sent familiar shoots of pain up his hip as his boots hit the hard-packed earth. The stench hit him first, not the clean smell of desert death, but something fouler: human waste, infection, fear. He drew his Colt .45 by instinct thumb, finding the hammer's familiar groove. In Apache territory, caution wasn't just wise, it was the difference between riding home and becoming another set of bones bleaching under the merciless sun. The door hung open on leather hinges, creaking in the wind like a wounded animal. Elias approached slowly, his boots crunching on broken glass and scattered debris. Inside, shafts of sunlight slanted through gaps in the walls, illuminating motes of dust that danced like spirits in the stagnant air. Then he saw her. She lay crumpled in the far corner, barely more than shadow and bone. At first glance, he thought she was dead, another casualty of the endless cycle of violence that plagued this God-forsaken territory. But then her chest rose just barely, and a soft moan escaped her lips. Apache. Even in her broken state, he could tell by the long black hair, the bronze skin, the beadwork on what remained of her torn dress. She'd been left here to die, that much was clear. Rawhide strips bound her wrists and ankles, cutting deep enough to paint them red. Her legs, Christ, her legs looked wrong, bent at angles that made his stomach turn. Elias holstered his weapon and knelt beside her, fighting the urge to recoil from the smell of infection and neglect. Up close, he could see she was young, maybe 25, with high cheekbones and full lips split by dehydration. Bruises painted her face in shades of purple and yellow, telling a story of violence that made his jaw clench. "Easy there," he whispered, the same tone he used with wounded horses. "Easy now." Her eyes flew open, dark as midnight, wild with terror. She tried to scramble away, but the bindings held her fast. A stream of Apache words poured from her lips, rapid and desperate. He didn't speak the language, but fear was universal. "I ain't gonna hurt you," Elias said, raising his hands to show they were empty. "I'm here to help." She studied his face with the intensity of someone who'd learned that survival depended on reading men's intentions in their eyes. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her, because she stopped struggling and watched him with wary alertness. Elias pulled out his skinning knife and she flinched. "Just cutting these ropes," he explained, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The rawhide had cut deep, and fresh blood welled as he severed her bonds. She bit back a cry, her hands flying to the raw wounds on her wrists. When he moved to examine her legs, she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. Her grip was desperate pleading. She shook her head frantically and spoke again in Apache, her voice cracking with thirst and pain. "I know it hurts," Elias said gently, "but I need to see how bad it is." Her legs had been broken deliberately, he could tell by the precision of the fractures. This wasn't the random violence of a raid or battle. This was punishment, torture. Someone had wanted her to suffer before she died. Jesus. He breathed anger flaring hot in his chest. What kind of animal would do this to another human being? He looked around the shack and found a dirty blanket and an empty water barrel. Working carefully, he eased her onto the blanket, wrapping her broken form as gently as he could. She was conscious but fading fast. Blood loss, dehydration, and infection were all taking their toll. "Can you understand me?" he asked. She nodded weakly, her eyes never leaving his face. "I'm going to take you to my place, get you some help. You understand?" Another nod so slight he almost missed it. "My name's Elias Ward. What's yours?" For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice like rustling leaves, "Tina." The name surprised him, not Apache, but the white man's bastardization of some longer, more beautiful word in her native tongue. He'd heard it before, usually applied to Apache women who'd been captured, traded, or forced into contact with white settlements. "Well, Tina," he said, sliding his arms under her wrapped form, "let's get you out of here." She was lighter than he'd expected, all sharp angles and protruding bones. As he lifted her, she made a sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a sigh, and her head rolled against his shoulder. The intimacy of it startled him. It had been so long since he'd held another human being, since he'd felt responsible for someone's life besides his own. The ride back to his ranch was a nightmare of careful navigation and constant vigilance. Every jolt sent fresh waves of pain through her broken body, and twice she lost consciousness entirely. Elias found himself talking to her, rambling stories about his cattle, the weather, anything to keep the desert silence at bay. "Got a spread about 5 miles south of here," he said, guiding Duchess around a particularly rocky outcropping. "Nothing fancy, but it's got good water and decent shelter. Been there 8 years now, ever since I mustered out of the cavalry." She stirred at that, her eyes focusing on his face with new interest. "Don't worry," he continued, reading her expression. "I ain't one of them blue coats who thinks every Apache is a savage. Hell, I've seen what savages look like, and they come in all colors." The sun was high overhead when they finally reached the Ward Ranch, a modest collection of buildings clustered around a natural spring. The main house was built of adobe and timber, practical rather than pretty, with a wide porch that caught the morning shade. A barn bunkhouse and several corrals completed the spread, along with a vegetable garden that had seen better days. Elias carried Tina straight to the house, kicking open the front door with more force than necessary. The interior was spartanly furnished, a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and precious few decorative touches. It was the home of a man who'd forgotten how to live, who merely existed from one day to the next. He laid her on his own bed, the only decent mattress in the house, then set about gathering supplies. Clean water, whiskey for disinfecting strips of cotton torn from an old shirt. His hands shook as he worked, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility he hadn't felt in years. When he returned to the bedroom, she was watching him again with those impossibly dark eyes. "This is gonna hurt," he warned, settling beside the bed with his makeshift medical kit. "But I gotta clean these wounds before they go septic." She nodded and gripped the edge of the mattress with both hands, bracing herself. The whiskey made her scream, a sound that cut through him like a blade. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't fight him or pull away. She endured it with a stoicism that humbled him, biting down on a leather strap he provided to keep from breaking her teeth. Her wrists and ankles were the worst, deep grooves where the rawhide had cut to the bone, but it was her legs that made him sick with rage. The breaks were clean, surgical, almost designed to cripple without killing. Whoever had done this had taken their time, had enjoyed it. "Who did this to you?" he asked as he worked more to fill the silence than because he expected an answer. My people. She whispered the words barely audible. Elias paused, a blood-soaked cloth halfway to the wash basin. Your own people did this. She nodded, fresh tears cutting tracks through the grime on her cheeks. I brought shame, spoke against war chief, or said white settlers in peaceful valley should live, said enough blood. She struggled with the English words, her accent thick but her meaning clear. War chief say I am traitor, weak, corrupted by white man's lies. So they did this and left you to die. Death would be mercy, she said simply. This is punishment for cowardice, for choosing compassion over revenge. Elias felt something twist in his chest, a recognition of kindred spirits, perhaps. He'd seen too many good men destroyed by other men's definitions of courage and loyalty. The army had its own ways of punishing those who questioned orders, who showed mercy to the enemy. Well, he said, returning to his work, guess we're both outcasts then. Over the next several hours, he did what he could for her injuries. The leg bones would need to be set properly, a job for someone with medical training. But he cleaned and bandaged what he could, forced water and thin broth down her throat, and made her as comfortable as possible. As evening approached, he sat in a chair beside the bed watching her sleep. She looked so small beneath the rough blankets, so fragile. But there was something in the set of her jaw, even in unconsciousness, that spoke of inner steel. This was a woman who had survived the worst her own people could inflict, and was still fighting. Tina, he said softly, testing the name on his tongue. She stirred, but didn't wake. In the lamplight, with the harsh lines of pain smoothed from her face, she looked almost ethereal, beautiful even. The thought surprised him. He'd trained himself not to notice such things, to see women only as potential complications or reminders of what he'd lost. A sound from outside made him reach for his rifle. Horses approaching fast, too fast for a casual visit. Elias moved to the window, keeping low, and peered through the curtains. 4 riders silhouetted against the dying light. He recognized them immediately, men from town, including Deputy Marshal Hawkins and Councilman Foreman. They rode into his yard with the confidence of men who believed they owned the territory. Hawkins, a lean scarecrow of a man with pale eyes and a perpetual sneer, dismounted first. Foreman followed thick around the middle with the soft hands and pink face of someone who'd never missed a meal or worked an honest day in his life. Ward, Hawkins called. We need to talk. Elias stepped onto his porch rifle, held casually but ready. Kinda late for a social call, ain't it, Hawkins? This ain't social, the deputy replied, his hand resting on his sidearm. We heard you might have taken in a guest, Apache woman. And if I have, Foreman stepped forward, his voice oozing false concern. Now, Elias, we understand your Christian impulses, truly we do. But harboring a hostile Apache, especially one who might have information about recent raids, well, that's a matter for the territorial authorities. She's half dead and crippled, Elias replied flatly. Don't think she's much of a threat to anyone. That's not the point, Hawkins interjected. Apache is Apache. They got ways of communicating we don't understand. Could be she's signaling her people, bringing them down on honest folks. Elias's grip tightened on his rifle. She stays. I'm afraid that's not your decision to make, Foreman said, producing a folded document from his coat. This here's a writ from Judge Patterson. Authorizes us to take custody of any Apache prisoners for questioning and disposal. The word disposal hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Elias knew what it meant, a quick trial, a quicker hanging, and another Apache body for the desert scavengers. She's not a prisoner, he said. She's under my protection. Hawkins laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Your protection, Ward, you're one man with a bum leg and a drinking problem. What protection you gonna offer against Apache war parties, against the territorial government, hell, against us? Enough to matter, Elias replied, chambering around. The sound froze all 4 men. Suddenly, the casual visit had become something else entirely, a standoff with potentially lethal consequences. The other two riders, local toughs named Crenshaw and Billings, spread out slightly, their hands hovering near their weapons. "Now don't be stupid, Ward," Foreman said, his voice losing its false friendliness. "We came here peaceful-like with legal authority. Don't make us come back with a posse." "You do what you gotta do," Elias said, "but she doesn't leave here with you tonight." For a long moment, nobody moved. The desert wind picked up, rattling the loose boards on the barn and carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled, a lonesome sound that seemed to voice what they were all thinking. Finally, Hawkins spat into the dust and remounted his horse. "This ain't over, Ward. Not by a long shot." "Didn't figure it was," Elias replied. He watched them ride away, their horses' hooves drumming a message of future violence into the hard earth. When they were gone, he remained on the porch for another hour, listening to the night sounds and thinking about the choice he'd just made. Inside, he found Tina awake, her eyes bright with fever, and something else, surprise maybe, or gratitude. "You stayed," she whispered. "Course I stayed. This is my house." "No," she said, struggling to sit up despite his protests. "You stayed. You chose." She paused, searching for the English words. "In my life, men take what they want, use what they need, throw away what they don't." Her voice broke slightly. "You are first who stays, who chooses to protect instead of use." Elias felt heat rise in his cheeks. He wasn't used to being seen as heroic hell. He wasn't sure he was. Just doing what any decent person would do. "No," she said with absolute certainty. "Not any person. You." She lay back down, exhausted by the effort of speaking, but before sleep claimed her again, she whispered two words that hit him like a physical blow. "Thank you." It was such a simple phrase, spoken in that soft, accented voice, but it carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of cruelty and disappointment, of men who had taken everything and given nothing in return. It was the voice of someone who had never expected kindness and was overwhelmed to receive it. Elias sat back down in his chair, the rifle across his knees, and prepared for a long night. Outside, the wind continued to howl, carrying with it the promise of storm clouds gathering on the horizon. But inside, in the warm circle of lamplight, something new was taking root, something fragile and precious that he'd thought lost forever. Hope. As the hours passed and Tina's breathing settled into the rhythm of deeper sleep, Elias found himself studying her face in the flickering light. The bruises were already fading from purple to yellow, and some of the tension had left her features. She looked younger, somehow more vulnerable, but also peaceful. It had been a long time since he'd seen true peace in another human being. He thought about Hawkins and Foreman, about the writ in the deputy's pocket and the barely concealed threat in their voices. They'd be back probably with reinforcements and legal justification for whatever they planned to do. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to load Tina into a wagon at first light and deliver her to the authorities himself. Claim he'd been planning to do it all along, that he'd just needed time to stabilize her injuries. But when he looked at her sleeping form, at the careful way she held herself even unconscious, as if expecting pain at any moment, he knew he couldn't do it. Whatever she'd done to earn her own people's wrath, it had been an act of conscience, of compassion. And compassion, in Elias's experience, was rare enough to be worth protecting. He'd made his choice the moment he lifted her from that filthy shack. Everything else was just details. The lamp burned low as midnight approached, casting dancing shadows on the adobe walls. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, the first promise of the autumn rains that would turn the desert briefly green before winter's grip took hold. Change was coming, whether he wanted it or not. But for now, in this moment, there was only the quiet rhythm of her breathing, the weight of his rifle, and the strange sensation of having someone to protect again. Someone who needed him not for what he could provide or how he could be used, but simply for his willingness to stand between her and the cruelties of the world. It was a feeling he'd almost forgotten he was capable of. And as sleep finally began to claim him, Elias Ward allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, saving Tina might end up saving him too. The desert wind sang its ancient song through the gaps in the walls, carrying secrets and promises in equal measure. And in the warmth of the ranch house, two broken souls began the long, uncertain process of healing not just their bodies, but something deeper and more essential, something that might, with time and care, grow into hope itself. Dawn broke like a promise over the desert horizon, painting the sky in shades of coral and gold that reminded Elias of better times when he'd believed the world could be beautiful instead of just brutal. He dozed fitfully in the chair beside Tina's bed, his rifle never far from reach, starting awake at every sound the wind carried across the scrubland. She was already conscious when the first rays of sunlight slanted through the bedroom window, those dark eyes studying him with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "You watched all night," she said, her voice stronger than it had been the evening before. "Someone had to," Elias replied, stretching the kinks from his neck. "How you feeling?" Tina considered the question with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned that honesty about weakness could be dangerous. "Like horse stepped on me," she said finally, "but alive, more alive than yesterday." The simple admission hit him harder than it should have. When was the last time he'd felt more alive than the day before? When had each sunrise brought hope instead of just another burden to shoulder? "Can you sit up?" he asked. "Got some broth heating on the stove. You need to get some real food in you if you're gonna heal proper." With his help, she managed to prop herself against the headboard, though the effort left her breathing hard. Her legs remained motionless beneath the blankets, whether from the breaks or some deeper damage he couldn't tell. But her upper body moved with surprising grace, and her grip on his arm was steady. "The men last night," she said, as he brought her a bowl of beef broth. "They come back, probably," Elias admitted. "Men like that don't give up easy, especially when they think they're in the right." "I bring danger to your house," Tina said, her voice heavy with guilt. "You should let them take me." Elias paused in the act of helping her hold the bowl, meeting her gaze directly. "That what you want, to go with them?" She was quiet for a long moment, steam from the broth curling between them like incense. When she spoke, her words came slowly, carefully chosen. What I want not matter for long time. I learned to want only to survive each day, to see one more sunrise." She took a sip of broth, then continued, "But last night when you stand against those men, I remember what it feel like to want something more. What's that? To belong somewhere, to have someone who," she searched for the words, "who think I worth protecting." The raw honesty in her voice made something twist in Elias's chest. He'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed, not for his skills or his labor or what he could provide, but simply for his willingness to stand firm when everything else was shifting sand. "Well," he said gruffly, "looks like you're stuck with me then, at least till you heal up." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, the first he'd seen from her. It transformed her face entirely, revealing glimpses of the woman she might have been before violence and betrayal carved their marks into her soul. Over the following days, they fell into a routine born of necessity and gradually seasoned with something approaching companionship. Each morning, Elias would help her sit up, bring her food and water, check her bandages for signs of infection. The wounds were healing cleaner than he'd dared hope. Whatever else could be said about Apache medicine, they knew how to survive injuries that would kill softer folk. Her legs were another matter entirely. The bones were knitting but slowly, and she couldn't feel anything below her knees. Whether that was permanent damage or just swelling pressing on nerves, only time would tell. "In my tribe," she told him one afternoon as he helped her exercise her arms to prevent the muscles from wasting, "broken warrior becomes burden. Cannot hunt, cannot fight, cannot contribute. Better to die with honor than live as..." She struggled with the English as incomplete thing. Good thing you're not with your tribe anymore then, Elias replied. Out here we make do with what we got. Been doing it myself for years. She studied his face with those penetrating dark eyes. What break you, Elias Ward? The question caught him off guard. Most folks were too polite or too scared to ask directly about the shadows that lived behind a man's eyes. But Tina had been broken herself. She recognized the signs. War, he said finally. And what came after? Tell me. It wasn't really a request, and somehow that made it easier to answer. Cavalry officer, like I mentioned, fought Apaches, Comanches, anybody the government said needed fighting. Thought I was serving my country, protecting settlers, bringing civilization to the frontier. He laughed bitterly. Hell, maybe I even believed it for a while. Tina waited patient as stone while he gathered the words. There was a village. Elias continued, his voice growing distant. Peaceful Apaches, mostly old folks and children. They'd been trying to make peace, wanted to talk terms with the territorial governor. My commanding officer, Colonel Morrison, he saw it different. Said talk was just Apache tricks, that the only good Apache was a dead Apache. You attack village, I followed orders. Elias said the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Right up until I saw what we were doing. Saw Morrison put his pistol to the head of a girl couldn't have been more than 10, saw him pull the trigger while she was crying for her mother. His hands clenched into fists. That's when I broke, I guess. Put my own gun to Morrison's head and told him it was over. You kill him. No, should have maybe, but I couldn't become the same kind of monster I was trying to stop. Elias met her gaze, seeing understanding there instead of judgment. They court-martialed me, of course, stripped me of rank, threw me out of the service, branded me a traitor and a coward. But you saved those people, some of them, the ones who were left. He was quiet for a moment, then added, Your English is getting better. You good teacher, Tina replied, and I have much time to practice lying here. As the weeks passed, her strength gradually returned. She began insisting on doing small tasks, mending his torn shirts, preparing simple meals she could manage from the bed. Her fingers were clever with needle and thread, creating patterns that were both beautiful and functional. My mother teach me, she explained when he commented on her skill. She say woman's hands must never be idle, must always create something useful or beautiful, preferably both. What happened to her? Tina's hands stilled on the fabric she was working. Soldiers, she said simply. Not your soldiers. Different ones when I was 16. They come to trade for horses, but they want more than horses. When she tried to protect me and my sister, she didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. The pain in her voice painted the picture clearly enough. I'm sorry, Elias said, meaning it. Sorry not bring her back, Tina replied. But you different kind of soldier. You remember what it mean to protect instead of take. The observation sat between them like a bridge being built, one careful beam at a time. They were both casualties of a war that had no real winners, only survivors trying to make sense of the wreckage left behind. It was during the third week that she first asked about getting up. Legs not feel anything, she said, pulling back the blankets to examine the still swollen limbs. But maybe they still work for standing. Elias had been dreading this moment. The bones seemed to be healing well enough, but the lack of sensation worried him. Still, he couldn't deny her the right to try. We can give it a shot, he said carefully, but slow and easy. Don't want to undo all the healing you've done. With great care, they maneuvered her to the edge of the bed. Her legs dangled uselessly, thin and pale from weeks of inactivity. When she tried to put weight on them, they buckled immediately, and only Elias's quick reflexes kept her from hitting the floor. Damn, she whispered, tears of frustration gathering in her eyes. Hey now, Elias said gently, helping her back onto the bed. First try. These things take time. How much time? The question came out sharper than she'd probably intended, edged with desperation. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe they'll come back, maybe they won't, but either way, we'll figure something out. We... The word had slipped out without him thinking about it, but looking at her face, hope warring with disbelief, he realized he meant it. Yeah, we. That night, unable to sleep, Elias found himself in his workshop behind the barn. He'd always been handy with wood and metal, and an idea had been forming in his mind ever since her failed attempt to stand. By lamplight, he began sketching designs, measuring and calculating, trying to remember the details of a contraption he'd seen once at a veterans' hospital back east. It took him 3 days of careful work, stealing moments between ranch chores and caring for Tina. When he finally wheeled the finished product into the bedroom, her reaction was everything he'd hoped for. "What is it?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Wheelchair," Elias said, feeling absurdly proud of the simple wooden construction. Saw one in Denver once, made for a soldier who lost his legs to a cannonball. Figured if it could work for him. He shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. The chair was crude but functional, a wooden seat with a back mounted on 2 large wheels, salvaged from an old cart with smaller wheels in front for steering. Leather straps could secure her legs, and handholds would let her propel herself forward. "You make this for me?" The wonder in her voice made all the splinters and aching muscles worthwhile. "Let's see if it works first," Elias said, but he was grinning despite his attempts at nonchalance. Getting her into the chair required patience and careful maneuvering, but once she was settled, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in weeks, Tina sat upright without support, her hands gripping the wheel rims with growing confidence. "Try pushing forward," Elias instructed. "Just a little pressure on both wheels at the same time." The chair lurched slightly, then rolled forward a foot. Then another. Tina's face lit up with an expression of pure joy that was almost painful to witness, the look of someone who'd been given back a piece of their humanity they'd thought lost forever. "I can move," she whispered, then louder, "I can move." She experimented with the controls, learning to turn, to stop, to navigate around the furniture. Her movements grew more confident with each attempt, and soon she was racing around the small bedroom with an enthusiasm that made Elias laugh out loud, a sound he hadn't made in so long it felt rusty in his throat. "Slow down there, speed demon," he said as she narrowly missed colliding with the washstand. "Don't want you breaking something else." "Cannot help it," Tina replied, her eyes bright with excitement. "Feel like bird with new wings." The metaphor was more apt than she probably realized. Over the following days, her mobility transformed, not just her physical capabilities, but her entire demeanor. No longer confined to bed, she insisted on helping with household tasks. She could reach the stove from her chair, could move around the kitchen with increasing skill, could even venture onto the porch to watch the sunset. More importantly, she began to smile. Not just the ghost of expression he'd glimpsed before, but real, genuine smiles that crinkled the corners of her eyes and revealed even white teeth. She laughed at his clumsy attempts to cook, teased him about his bachelor housekeeping, and gradually began to share stories of her life before the breaking. "I had horse once," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Beautiful pinto mare, smart as any human. Her name was Ayana, eternal blossom in my language. She could run like wind, but gentle enough that children could ride her. What happened to her? When my people cast me out, they take everything. Horse weapons, even water skin my grandmother make for me." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but he could hear the pain underneath. "Say I not deserve to keep gifts from tribe I betray. That what you did, betray your tribe?" Tina was quiet for so long he thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, carefully. "War Chief Nalnish, he plan attack on Valley Settlement. Peaceful people, mostly farmers with children. They never hurt anyone, just want to work land and raise families." She turned to look at him, moonlight silvering her features. I know these people. I trade with them, sometimes learn their language. See they not all monsters like Nalnish say. So you warned them. I try to speak reason first. Tell Nalnish that killing innocents make us no better than worst white soldiers. That Apache way is to protect, not to become thing we fight against. She laughed bitterly. He say I corrupted by white man's weakness. Say I forget what soldiers do to our people, to our children. But you didn't forget. No, I remember everything, but I also remember my mother's teaching that strength come from knowing when not to use violence, not from using it whenever you can. Tina's hands clenched on the arms of her wheelchair. So when he refused to listen, when war party prepared a ride, I go to settlement, warn them, help them prepare defense. Elias whistled low. That took guts. Took foolishness, she corrected. War party fail, but some escape back to camp. They tell Nalnish what happened, who warned the whites. Next night, they come for me. The rest of the story was written in her broken legs, in the scars on her wrists, in the haunted depths of her eyes. But there was something else there, too. A quiet pride that spoke of choices made and consequences accepted. You regret it? Elias asked. I regret pain they cause, Tina said honestly, but not choice. Those families live because I speak. Children grow up, have children of their own. That worth broken bones. As autumn deepened into winter, their partnership evolved beyond mere caregiver and patient. Tina proved herself capable of far more than either of them had initially expected. She could shoot her upper body strength and steady hands, making her deadly accurate with a rifle. She could cook meals that made his simple fare seem like slop by comparison, and she could work leather and fabric with a skill that was almost magical, creating useful items they both needed. You make me lazy, Elias complained one afternoon, watching her stitch a patch onto his torn jacket with quick, precise movements. Pretty soon I won't know how to do anything for myself. Good, Tina replied without looking up. You do too much alone already. Everyone need help sometimes. The simple observation struck him like a physical blow. When had he become so determined to be self-sufficient that he'd forgotten the basic human need for connection, for shared burdens and mutual support? Speaking of help, he said, been thinking about fixing that broken section of fence in the north pasture. Could use an extra pair of eyes to make sure I'm doing it right. Tina glanced up from her sewing, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. They both knew he could repair fence in his sleep. He'd been doing it for years without assistance. But the offer to include her, to make her feel useful beyond the confines of the house, was his way of acknowledging what they were becoming. Partners. The next morning they made their first expedition together beyond the immediate vicinity of the ranch house. Tina's wheelchair, while functional on smooth surfaces, wasn't designed for rough terrain, so Elias rigged a travois-style carrier behind his horse, cushioned with blankets and designed to keep her steady while they traveled. Feel ridiculous, she muttered as he helped her into the makeshift conveyance. Like cargo being hauled to market. Feel grateful you're not walking, Elias replied with a grin. Besides, this way you can enjoy the scenery without having to watch where you're going. The ride to the damaged fence took them across some of the most beautiful country in the territory, rolling hills covered in sage and buffalo grass, with red rock formations jutting up like ancient monuments to forgotten gods. Tina had lived in this land all her life, but seeing it from this new perspective seemed to fill her with wonder. Different when you're not running or hiding, she observed, as they paused at the crest of a hill overlooking the valley. Can actually see beauty instead of just danger. That's the first time you've talked about running or hiding, Elias noted carefully. First time I feel safe enough to remember without fear, she replied. You give me that gift, Elias Ward, gift of feeling safe in my own mind. They worked on the fence together, Tina directing him from her chair, while he handled the heavy lifting and precise placement. Her eye for detail was impressive. She caught problems he would have missed, suggested improvements that made the repair stronger than the original construction. "Where'd you learn so much about building?" he asked as they shared a lunch of cold beef and biscuits in the shade of a cottonwood tree. "Necessity," she said simply. "Apache women learn many things: how to build shelter that stand against wind and weather, how to make weapons when men are away, how to see land the way it wants to be used instead of forcing it to serve." She gestured at the fence line they'd been repairing. "Your fence fight against natural flow of water, of animal movement. Small changes make it work with land instead of against it." Elias followed her gaze, seeing the terrain through her eyes. She was right. The original fence placement had been chosen for convenience rather than wisdom, ignoring the subtle contours that guided everything from rainfall runoff to deer paths. "You want to redesign the whole thing?" he asked. "If you willing to listen to broken Apache woman," she said with a self-deprecating smile. "I'm willing to listen to someone who knows what she's talking about," Elias corrected. "Apache white Mexican don't matter. Good sense is good sense." Over the following weeks, they embarked on a complete overhaul of the ranch's infrastructure. Tina's suggestions were invariably practical and effective, relocating water troughs to take advantage of natural drainage, adjusting corral positions to provide better shelter from prevailing winds, even changing the layout of the vegetable garden to maximize sun exposure while minimizing water loss. Working together brought out aspects of both their personalities that had been buried under years of solitude and pain. Elias discovered he enjoyed having someone to bounce ideas off, someone who could challenge his assumptions and offer alternatives he never would have considered. Tina revealed a quick wit and a dry sense of humor that had survived everything her tormentors had done to break her spirit. "You sure you not part Apache?" she teased one afternoon as he cursed creatively at a stubborn fence post. "Sound just like my uncle when his horse step on his foot." "Your uncle no words like that?" Elias asked, momentarily distracted from his struggle with the post. "My uncle no words make your ears burn off," Tina replied solemnly, then burst into laughter at his expression. "Apache not all noble warriors and wise medicine men. We have fools and clumsy men and people who swear at rocks, just like white folks." It was during one of these working sessions that they were interrupted by visitors. 3 riders approached from the south, moving at an easy pace that suggested they weren't in immediate pursuit of anything. But something about their posture, the way they scanned the landscape, put Elias on alert. "Company," he said quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle. Tina followed his gaze, her body tensing in the wheelchair. "I know them," she said, her voice flat with recognition and something that might have been fear. The lead rider was a tall Apache man with graying hair braided with feathers and beads. His companions were younger, both armed with rifles and wearing the hard expressions of men who'd seen too much violence. They rode with the easy confidence of people who owned the land they traveled across. "Nalnish," Tina whispered, and Elias felt his blood turn to ice water. The war chief who had ordered her breaking, the man who had turned his own people against her for the crime of showing mercy. "Stay behind me," Elias said, chambering a round in his rifle. "No," Tina said firmly. "This, my fight. My choice bring us here." The 3 Apache riders reined in about 50 yards away, just beyond easy rifle range. Nalnish raised one hand in what might have been a greeting, or might have been a signal to his companions. "Tina of the Broken Wings," he called out in heavily accented English, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "You live still. The desert spirits must find your suffering entertaining." "I live despite your cruelty, Nalnish," she replied, her voice steady and strong. "I live because good men still exist in world, even if my own people forget what goodness looks like." The war chief's face darkened at the implied insult. "You speak of goodness while you contaminate yourself with white man's touch, while you betray blood of your ancestors for comfort of enemy's bed." Elias felt rage flare in his chest at the crude implication, but Tina's hand on his arm kept him from responding immediately. "I speak of goodness because I found man who protects instead of destroys," she said calmly. "Man who heals instead of breaks. You want to see contamination? Look in mirror Nalnish. See what hatred make of proud Apache warrior." For a moment, Elias thought the war chief might order an immediate attack. The younger men's hands were tight on their weapons, their horses dancing nervously in response to their riders' tension. But Nalnish held up his hand again, a gesture that might have been restraint or calculation. "I come to offer you choice, broken one," he said finally. "Return to your people. Submit to purification ritual. Accept punishment for your betrayal, and you may find place among us again." "What punishment?" Tina asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "Death," Nalnish replied matter-of-factly. "But death with honor among your people, instead of slow rot in white man's house. Your bones will rest in sacred ground instead of cursed earth." "Generous offer," Tina said dryly. "I choose cursed earth." The war chief's expression hardened further. "Then you choose war, not just for yourself, but for white man who corrupts you, for this place, for anyone who shelters broken traitor." "That's enough," Elias said, finally stepping forward. "She's made her choice. You got any quarrel with that? You can settle it with me." Nalnish studied him with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey. "You are Ward," he said after a moment. "Soldier who betrays his own people for Apache lives." The fact that the war chief knew his name and history sent a chill down Elias's spine. How long had they been watching? How much did they know about his daily routines, his defenses, his weaknesses? "I'm a man who protects what's mine," Elias replied carefully, "and she is yours." The question hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire loaded with implications and potential consequences. Elias felt Tina's eyes on him waiting for his answer. The easy response would be to deny any claim to position her as just a temporary guest who meant nothing to him personally. It might even diffuse the situation, convince Nalnish that pursuing vengeance wasn't worth the effort. But looking at her face, seeing the hope and fear warring in her expression, he knew there was only one answer he could give. "She is," he said simply. Nalnish nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Then you both will die together. Perhaps that is fitting." He turned his horse, preparing to leave, then paused. 3 days, Ward. I give you 3 days to say prayers to your white man's God and prepare for what comes. After that we return with warriors enough to water this desert with your blood." The 3 riders wheeled their horses and galloped away, leaving Elias and Tina alone with the weight of the threat hanging over them like storm clouds on the horizon. "Well," Tina said after a long moment, "now you know true cost of sheltering broken Apache woman." Elias looked down at her, seeing not brokenness but strength, not burden but partner. "Worth every penny," he said, meaning it, more than any words he'd ever spoken. But as they watched the dust cloud raised by the departing riders fade into the distance, both of them knew that the easy days of healing and partnership were over. War was coming to the Ward Ranch, and 3 days wasn't nearly enough time to prepare for the storm that was about to break over their heads. The silence that followed Nalnish's departure felt heavier than the desert air before a thunderstorm. Elias stood motionless, his rifle still in his hands, watching the dust settle where the 3 riders had vanished into the heat shimmer. 3 days. The words echoed in his mind like the tolling of a funeral bell. "We should go back to house," Tina said quietly, breaking the spell that held them both frozen. "Much to prepare." Her calm acceptance of their situation both impressed and worried him. She spoke as if preparing for a war party's attack was as routine as mending fence or cooking dinner. Perhaps given her life experiences, it was. The journey back to the ranch house felt different now. Every rock formation could hide an ambush. Every distant bird could be a signal between scouts. Elias found himself cataloging defensive positions and fields of fire with the automatic precision of his old cavalry, training his mind already shifting from rancher to soldier. "How many warriors will he bring?" he asked as they reached the house. Tina considered the question carefully. "Nalnish is proud man but not foolish. He know you, soldier, know you have weapons and knowledge of fighting. He bring enough warriors to be certain of victory, but not so many that other chiefs think he afraid of one white man and broken woman." She paused, her dark eyes distant with calculation. 12, maybe 15, enough to surround house attack from all sides. 15 warriors against one man and a woman who couldn't walk. The mathematics of survival didn't look promising, but Elias had faced worse odds during the war. At least this time he'd be fighting for something that mattered instead of following orders that turned his stomach. Once inside, they began their preparations with the methodical efficiency of people who understood that their lives depended on attention to detail. Elias inventoried their weapons and ammunition, while Tina examined the house itself with tactical eyes, identifying weak points and potential improvements. "Windows," she said, wheeling herself around the main room. "Too many, too large. Easy targets for arrows, easy way for warriors to enter." "We can board up some of them," Elias replied, "but we'll need at least a few for shooting positions." "Yes, keep 2 facing different directions, one toward front, approach one toward back. Block others with furniture, anything that stop arrows and bullets." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, transforming the ranch house from a home into a fortress. Heavy furniture was dragged against windows, creating firing ports while blocking easy access. Water barrels were positioned strategically in case of fire arrows. Spare ammunition was distributed to multiple locations, so they wouldn't be trapped without bullets if one cache was overrun. "Food," Tina reminded him as they secured the last window. "If they cannot take us quickly, they may try to wait us out." Elias nodded, already thinking ahead. "Got enough jerky and canned goods to last a week, maybe more if we're careful. Water's the bigger concern. They could cut off access to the well." "Then we fill every pot and basin tonight," she said practically. "Also, buckets, wash basins, anything that hold water." As darkness fell, they continued their preparations by lamplight. The domesticity of their earlier weeks together was replaced by the grim efficiency of warriors preparing for battle. Yet something had deepened between them during the day's work, a trust forged not just in affection, but in shared purpose and mutual dependence. "You could still leave," Tina said suddenly as she cleaned and loaded rifles with practiced movements. "Take horse ride to town before they return. Tell authorities that Apache woman steal your weapons, force you to help her. They believe you probably give you reward." Elias paused in his work of checking cartridges. "That what you want me to do?" "What I want and what makes sense are different things," she replied without looking up from the rifle she was examining. "You, good man, Elias Ward, good men should not die for mistakes of broken women." "Maybe," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "But good men also don't abandon their partners when things get dangerous, and that's what you are, Tina, my partner." She did look up, then her eyes bright with unshed tears. "In all my life, no one ever called me partner before, not equal. Always daughter or woman or prisoner or burden. Never, never someone who stand beside instead of in front or behind." The raw honesty in her voice made his chest tighten. "Well, you are. Have been since the day you started helping me fix that fence, maybe even before that." They finished their preparations in comfortable silence, 2 people who had found in each other what they'd both thought lost forever, someone worth fighting for, someone worth dying beside if it came to that. The second day dawned gray and oppressive, with heavy clouds building on the horizon. Elias took it as an omen, though whether good or ill remained to be seen. Rain would make visibility poor for attackers, but it would also turn the adobe walls soft and provide cover for anyone trying to approach the house. "Storm coming," Tina observed from her position at the front window, where she'd taken the first watch while he caught a few hours of sleep. Might work in our favor, Elias said, accepting a cup of coffee from her steady hands. Apache don't like fighting in heavy rain any more than anyone else. Naalnish will use it, she corrected. He's smart fighter, wait for storm to break, then attack during worst of weather. No, we expect him to wait for clear skies. The observation was sound, and it forced Elias to reconsider their defensive preparations. Reduced visibility could work both ways, harder for the attackers to coordinate, but also harder for the defenders to see them coming. They spent the morning adjusting their plans, creating additional firing positions, and establishing signals they could use if the storm made voice communication impossible. Tina proved invaluable in this planning. Her knowledge of Apache tactics and her understanding of how warriors thought gave them insights that could mean the difference between survival and death. They will test defenses first, she explained as they checked their shooting lanes for the 10th time. Send 1 or 2 warriors to probe weak spots. See how we respond. Look for patterns in our movement, count muzzle flashes to know how many guns we have. So we vary our positions, Elias said, understanding immediately. Make them think there are more of us. Yes. Also, she hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue. What, they expect to fight white soldier and helpless Apache woman, she said slowly. They not expect woman who can shoot, who know their ways of fighting, that our advantage if we use it right. The implications of her suggestion were clear. For their deception to work, she would have to be more than just another gun in the fight. She would have to be a tactician, someone who could anticipate and counter Apache strategies in real time. You up for that? He asked. It's going to mean making life or death decisions in the middle of battle. Tina's expression hardened with determination. They break my legs, cast me out to die. Now come to finish what they start. Yes, I am up for making those decisions. By midday, the storm clouds had built into towering thunderheads that turned the sky the color of old pewter. The first drops of rain began to fall as they finished their final preparations. Irregular spatters that drummed against the roof and windows like impatient fingers. Tonight, Tina said with absolute certainty. They come tonight when storm is strongest. Elias nodded, feeling the truth of it in his bones. The waiting was almost over. Soon they would discover whether their preparations were enough, whether their partnership could survive the ultimate test. They ate an early dinner as the rain began, in earnest heavy drops that promised to become a downpour before long. Neither of them had much appetite, but they forced themselves to eat anyway. They would need their strength for what was coming. Tell me about your family, Tina said suddenly as they sat listening to the rain intensify against the windows. Not much to tell, Elias replied. Parents died when I was young. No brothers or sisters. Army was my family for most of my adult life until... He shrugged, the gesture encompassing his disgrace and exile. No woman, no children. There was someone once. Sarah. Met her in Denver while I was on leave. His voice grew distant with memory. Pretty girl, kind heart. We were talking about marriage when the court-martial happened. When she found out what I'd done, what I'd become, well, she decided she couldn't be associated with a disgraced officer. Her loss, Tina said firmly. Maybe, or maybe she was smart to cut ties with damaged goods. Elias met her eyes across the table. What about you? Ever think about having a family? Tina was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden tabletop. Once, young warrior named Ahiga. It mean he fights in my language. He was brave, handsome, everything Apache girl supposed to want in husband. A sad smile touched her lips. He died in cavalry raid 3 summers ago. Sometimes I think maybe that was when I start to understand that endless fighting only bring endless dying. Is that why you spoke against the attack on the settlement, because of him? Partly, but mostly because I see children there, white children playing same games. Apache children play learning to walk, learning to speak their first words. And I think, How can killing these small ones honor Ahiga's memory? How can creating more orphans make his death mean something? The rain was coming harder now, drumming against the roof with increasing intensity. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by rumbling thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. "Storm's getting worse," Elias observed. "Perfect for attack," Tina agreed. "We should take positions, check weapons one more time." They moved with practiced efficiency to their assigned posts. Elias took the front window where he had a clear view of the most likely approach routes. Tina positioned herself at the back window, her wheelchair arranged so she could move quickly between firing positions if necessary. "Remember," she called softly across the room, "they come from multiple directions at once. Don't focus too much on front, that might be distraction, while real attack come from side or back." Elias nodded, though she probably couldn't see the gesture in the dim light. They'd decided against using lamps or candles, preferring to keep their positions hidden as long as possible. The storm reached its full fury just after midnight. Rain lashed the house with almost physical force, and lightning turned the night into a strobe of brilliant white and absolute black. Thunder crashed overhead with such violence that it was impossible to hear anything else, including the approach of enemies. It was during one of these thunderclaps that Elias caught a glimpse of movement near the corral. Just a shadow there and gone in the space between lightning flashes, but enough to send his pulse racing. "Movement front right," he called softly to Tina. "I see something back left," she replied. "Maybe 2 figures." So it was beginning. Exactly as she'd predicted, they were using the storm as cover for a coordinated attack from multiple directions. Elias felt the familiar calm settle over him, the same detached focus that had gotten him through countless battles during the war. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford now. The first arrow came during the next lightning flash, striking the wooden shutter beside his window with enough force to penetrate 2 inches into the oak. It was followed immediately by 2 more aimed at Tina's position. "They're testing our positions," she called out. "Don't shoot yet. Let them commit to attack." The wisdom of her advice became clear over the next several minutes. More arrows flew out of the darkness, probing their defenses, trying to draw return fire that would reveal their exact locations and numbers. It took enormous discipline not to respond, to let the attackers think they might have achieved surprise. The real assault came with brutal suddenness. War cries erupted from 3 directions at once, barely audible over the storm, but unmistakably hostile. Dark figures rushed toward the house, some carrying torches that sputtered and flared in the driving rain. "Now," Tina said calmly. Elias opened fire, his first shot taking down a warrior who was trying to reach the front door with a torch. The man spun and fell, his light extinguished in the mud. Behind him, Elias could hear Tina's rifle barking steadily, methodically working through targets at the back of the house. The attackers had expected surprise and quick victory. Instead, they found themselves caught in crossfire from defenders who knew exactly where they were and what they were trying to do. Several warriors fell in the first exchange, and the others quickly sought cover behind the barn and outbuildings. "Reload," Tina called during a brief lull. They regroup. "Now try different approach." Elias fed fresh cartridges into his rifle, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. This was what he'd been trained for, what all those years of cavalry service had prepared him for. But it was also different this time. He was fighting for something that mattered, something worth protecting. The second wave came from unexpected directions. While some warriors maintained suppressing fire from their original positions, others had circled around to attack from the sides of the house. Only Tina's warning shout saved Elias from an Apache who had somehow reached the front porch and was trying to smash through the barricaded door with a war club. His shot took the warrior center mass, dropping him immediately. But the distraction had allowed another attacker to reach Tina's window, and Elias heard her cry out as an arrow grazed her shoulder. "You hit bad," he called, trying to maintain his own firing position while looking back toward her. Just blood, she replied through gritted teeth. Keep shooting, more coming. Indeed, the attackers seemed to have unlimited numbers. Every time Elias thought they'd driven them back, more figures appeared out of the storm-lashed darkness. His ammunition was running low, and he could tell from the decreasing frequency of Tina's shots that she was having the same problem. Then he heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of axes biting into wood. They were trying to break through the back wall of the house in the blind spot between the two defended windows. "They're coming through the back wall," he shouted to Tina. "I know," she called back. "Cannot stop them, and watch window 2. We need new plan." The new plan, born of desperation and tactical necessity, was as simple as it was dangerous. They would abandon their fixed positions and fight a mobile defense using Tina's wheelchair to reposition quickly while Elias provided covering fire. "Can you move fast in that thing?" he asked, during a brief lull in the incoming fire. "Fast enough," she replied grimly. "You ready? Let's do it." They moved as one, Tina rolling her wheelchair away from her window position while Elias laid down covering fire to keep the attackers' heads down. Behind them, the sound of axes grew louder. They were running out of time. The back wall gave way just as they reached the center of the room. 3 Apache warriors burst through the gap, war cries echoing in the confined space. The first one died to Elias's rifle, the second to a perfectly placed shot from Tina's position. The third managed to reach them before being brought down his war club, missing Elias's head by inches. But more were coming through the breach, and their ammunition was nearly exhausted. Elias felt the familiar weight of defeat settling over him. They had fought well, but the odds were simply too great. That was when Tina surprised him one final time. "Get down!" she shouted, and before he could react, she was rolling her wheelchair directly toward the breach in the wall. In her hands was one of the kerosene lamps from the kitchen, its wick lit and burning bright. "Tina, no!" Elias yelled, understanding her intention, but she was already committed to her desperate gambit. The wheelchair hit the pile of debris from the broken wall at full speed, launching her forward into the midst of the attacking warriors. The lamp flew from her hands, shattering against the wooden wall and spreading burning kerosene across everything it touched. Fire erupted in the confined space, driving back the attackers and filling the room with smoke and screaming. Elias dove forward, trying to reach Tina through the chaos and flames. He found her crumpled beside her overturned wheelchair, blood streaming from a head wound, but still conscious. "Did it work?" she gasped as he pulled her clear of the spreading fire. "Yeah," he said, lifting her in his arms as burning debris began to fall from the ceiling. It worked. The fire had indeed driven back the immediate attack, but it had also trapped them in a burning building. Smoke filled the room, making breathing difficult and visibility nearly impossible. They had to get out, but every exit was either blocked or covered by hostile fire. "Window," Tina said weakly, pointing toward the front of the house. "Break window, go through fast before they can react." It was their only chance. Elias kicked out the remaining glass from the front window, his rifle ready for whatever waited outside. The rain immediately soaked them both, but it also provided cover and helped extinguish the burning embers that clung to their clothes. The leap from window to ground jarred every bone in his body, but he managed to keep his grip on Tina. Behind them, the ranch house was fully engulfed in flames, the fire spreading too quickly for the rain to stop it. "Keep moving," Tina urged. "Get to barn, better cover there." They made it to the barn just as the roof of the house collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber. The sound seemed to signal the end of the attack. Suddenly, the war cries stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the ranch yard. "Is it over?" Elias asked, still breathing hard from their escape. Tina listened intently to the sounds of the night, her head cocked like a hunting cat. "They pull back," she said finally. "Regroup, decide what to do. Fire change everything now. They cannot take us alive for torture, cannot count this as proper victory over enemies who surrender." So what happens now? Before she could answer, a voice called out from the darkness. Nilnish's voice, speaking in English so they would both understand. Ward, broken woman, you fight better than expected. But morning comes soon and you have no shelter, no supplies. We can wait longer than you can survive. Elias considered their situation. The war chief was right, they had escaped immediate death, but their long-term prospects weren't good. The house was destroyed along with most of their supplies and ammunition. The barn provided temporary shelter, but it wouldn't protect them from a determined assault. What do you want, Nilnish? He called back. Single combat, came the reply. You and me, no weapons but knives. Winner takes both lives, yours and the broken woman's. Honor satisfied either way. Elias felt Tina stiffen in his arms. No, she whispered urgently, is trap. He much younger, stronger. He kill you, then take me anyway. But Elias was already considering the offer. It was probably a trap, as she said, but it was also their only realistic chance of survival. Even if he lost, the single combat would satisfy Apache concepts of honor in a way that simple murder wouldn't. I need to think about it, he called out. Dawn, Nilnish replied. You have until dawn to decide. After that, we take you both by force. The rain continued to fall, but more gently now, as if the storm's fury had been spent along with the fire that had consumed their home. In the barn's musty darkness, Elias held Tina close and tried to figure out how to save them both. It was then that she spoke the words that changed everything. There is another way, she said quietly, but you will not like it. Tell me. Apache laws say that woman who choose her own death cannot be touched by enemies afterward, cannot be tortured, cannot be dishonored. She struggled with the words, if I take my own life before dawn, you become just white man who help wounded traveler, no blood debt, no reason for continued fighting. No, Elias said immediately, absolutely not. Listen to me, she insisted. You can live, build new house, new life, find good woman who can give you children happiness. All you have to do is let me choose honorable death instead of torture. I said no, and I meant it. His voice carried a finality that brooked no argument. We're partners, remember, partners don't abandon each other, and they sure as hell don't ask each other to die for convenience. Tina was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. Then we die together when sun rises. Maybe, Elias admitted, but if we do, we'll die as equals, as partners who chose to stand together instead of apart. He felt her nod against his chest, and something passed between them in that moment, an understanding deeper than words, a bond forged not just in attraction or affection, but in shared values and mutual respect. Outside, the night was growing lighter. Dawn was still hours away, but the worst of the storm had passed, and with it their temporary reprieve. Soon they would have to face whatever Nilnish had planned for them, but for now, in the darkness of the barn, they held each other and drew strength from their connection. Whatever came with the sunrise, they would meet it together, as partners, as equals, as two people who had found something worth fighting for in each other, and who refused to let fear or desperation drive them apart. The fire that had consumed their house still glowed in the distance, a beacon of defiance against the night. And in its light, Elias Ward and Tina of the Broken Wings prepared for the most important battle of their lives. The first pale hint of dawn crept across the eastern sky like spilled milk, casting long shadows through the barn's weathered boards. Elias had dozed fitfully against a hay bale, his arms still wrapped protectively around Tina, but the approaching light brought with it the weight of impossible choices and dwindling time. She was already awake when he stirred, her dark eyes focused on something beyond the barn walls, listening, calculating, preparing for what was to come. They're moving, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the settling sounds of the rain-soaked ranch. Positioning themselves for whatever Nilnish has planned. Elias strained his ears and caught it too, The subtle sounds of men moving with practiced stealth, the soft whisper of moccasins on wet earth, the almost inaudible creak of leather and weapon harnesses. The Apache were taking positions around the barn, ensuring that any attempt at escape would be met with swift and deadly force. "How many?" he asked quietly. "8, maybe 9, still alive," Tina replied after a moment's consideration. "We hurt them badly last night, but Naelnish still has enough warriors to finish this." The mathematics of their situation hadn't improved with daylight. They had perhaps a dozen rounds of ammunition remaining between them, no food and limited water. The barn, while providing temporary shelter, was essentially a trap one way in, and that way was certainly watched. "Ward," Naelnish's voice cut through the morning air closer than before. "Sun rises. Time to decide single combat, or we take you both alive for proper Apache justice." Elias helped Tina sit up against the hay bales, checking her injuries in the growing light. The arrow wound on her shoulder had stopped bleeding, but her head injury from the wheelchair crash looked worse. A deep gash above her left temple that had painted half her face with dried blood. "I can still shoot straight," she said, reading his expression, "if it comes to fighting. Let's hope it doesn't." Elias rose carefully, his rifle in hand, but pointed downward. "I'm coming out Naelnish, but I want to talk terms first." "No terms," came the immediate reply. "Single combat or slow death. Choose now." Elias looked down at Tina, seeing his own determination reflected in her eyes. They'd come too far together to let fear make their final choice for them. "If I lose," he began. "You won't," she interrupted firmly. "And if you do, I still have bullets left for myself. They won't take me alive." The quiet resolve in her voice both humbled and terrified him. This woman, who had been broken and cast out by her own people, still possessed a core of steel that suffering hadn't been able to bend. She would die before she'd allow herself to be tortured again, and she was prepared to make that choice without hesitation. "Then we understand each other," Elias said, leaning down to brush his lips against her forehead, a gesture that felt like both blessing and farewell. He walked to the barn door, each step feeling like a judgment rendered. Outside, the ranch yard looked like a battlefield. From some ancient war, the smoldering remains of his house, sending thin columns of smoke into the gray sky, scattered debris marking where desperate fighting had raged through the storm-lashed night. Naelnish stood in the center of the yard, no longer the distant figure shouting threats from horseback, but a flesh-and-blood man revealed in the morning light. He was perhaps 50, with graying hair braided with eagle feathers, and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life under the desert sun. Scars marked his arms and chest, some from battles with enemies, others from ritual ceremonies that spoke of spiritual as well as physical strength. "You chose to fight," the war chief said, as Elias emerged from the barn. It wasn't a question. "I chose to protect what's mine," Elias replied, echoing his words from 3 days earlier. Naelnish nodded approvingly. "Good. Death with honor is better than life with shame." He drew a large knife from his belt, not the trade steel most Apache carried, but traditional flint napped to razor sharpness and hafted with carved bone. "Old way is best way for old grievances." Elias drew his own blade, a standard cavalry saber he'd carried through the war and its bloody aftermath. The steel felt familiar in his hand, but also strange. It had been years since he'd fought with anything other than firearms, and knife work required different skills, different reflexes. The other Apache warriors had formed a loose circle around the combat area, their faces impassive masks that revealed nothing of their thoughts or loyalties. But Elias caught glimpses of respect in some eyes, curiosity in others. Whatever they thought of his choices, they recognized courage when they saw it. "Begin when you are ready," Naelnish said, settling into a fighting crouch that spoke of decades of experience with blade work. Elias circled slowly, looking for openings while trying to read his opponent's intentions. The war chief was older than him by perhaps a decade, but moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd kept himself in fighting condition through constant practice and discipline. This wouldn't be won by strength or speed. It would come down to experience, cunning, and the willingness to take risks that could prove fatal. They closed simultaneously, Nalnish's flint blade whistling through the air in a horizontal slash aimed at Elias's ribs. Elias parried with his saber, the steel ringing against stone in a shower of sparks, then riposted with a thrust toward the war chief's shoulder. But Nalnish was already moving, spinning away from the thrust, while bringing his knife around in a backhand slice that would have opened Elias's throat if he hadn't jerked backward at the last instant. The flint blade passed close enough to his neck that he felt the displaced air against his skin. They separated, both breathing hard, both reassessing their opponent's capabilities. The brief exchange had told them both what they needed to know. This would be a fight between equals, decided by small margins and smaller mistakes. "You fight like soldier," Nalnish observed, not lowering his guard. "All technique, no spirit." "I fight like someone who wants to live," Elias replied, keeping his own blade at the ready. "Living and surviving are different things," the war chief said. "You will learn this before you die." They came together again, this time in a sustained engagement that carried them across half the ranch yard. Naalnish fought with the flowing circular movements of Apache blade work slashes and cuts that seemed to come from impossible angles, attacks that blended seamlessly into defensive positions. Elias countered with the linear precision of cavalry saber technique, thrusts and parries designed for mounted combat, but adapted for fighting on foot. Blood began to mark both men, shallow cuts on arms and shoulders, where guards had been beaten or timing had been just slightly off. Neither had landed a decisive blow, but the accumulating damage was taking its toll on both fighters' speed and endurance. It was during one of these exchanges that Elias heard something that changed everything: the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching from the south. Multiple horses moving fast, raising enough dust to be visible even at a distance. Nalnish heard it too, his eyes flicking toward the sound, even as he pressed another attack. That momentary distraction was enough. Elias's saber slipped past the war chief's guard, opening a deep cut across his chest that sent him staggering backward. "Riders coming," one of the Apache warriors called out in their native tongue. Nalnish replied in the same language, his voice sharp with command. The warriors began to spread out, taking defensive positions, while keeping their weapons trained on both Elias and the barn, where Tina waited. The approaching riders resolved into a column of cavalry blue uniformed soldiers, with carbines and sabers led by an officer Elias recognized with a mixture of hope and dread. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, the same Morrison whose brutality had cost Elias his career and his honor years earlier. The man was older now, his hair showing gray beneath his campaign hat, but he rode with the same arrogant bearing that had characterized his command during their shared service. "Stand down, all of you," Morrison called out as his column deployed into a skirmish line. "This is United States territory, and you're all under arrest for acts of violence against lawful settlers." Nalnish straightened, blood still seeping from the chest wound Elias had given him, but his dignity intact. "We fight honorable combat for stolen woman," he said in careful English. "No concern of blue coats." "Everything in this territory is my concern," Morrison replied coldly. He turned his attention to Elias, and recognition flickered in his pale eyes. "Well, well, Elias Ward, should have known you'd be at the center of something like this." "Colonel," Elias acknowledged, not bothering to hide his distaste. "Still specializing in arriving after the real fighting's done, I see." Morrison's face darkened at the jibe, but before he could respond, Tina's voice cut through the tension from the barn doorway. "Elias," she called, "don't trust him. Blue coat officer like this one, he killed my family when I was young girl. Same eyes, same hate. Morrison's hand moved to his sidearm at the accusation, but he kept his voice level. The woman is clearly deranged from her injuries. We're here to restore order and recover stolen property. What stolen property? Elias demanded. Apache prisoner who escaped from territorial custody, Morrison replied smoothly. Wanted for murder and conspiracy against lawful settlers. There's a substantial bounty for her return. Elias felt the pieces clicking together in his mind, the convenient timing of Morrison's arrival, the too-ready explanation for Tina's legal status, the way the colonel's eyes kept flicking toward the barn where she waited. This wasn't a rescue mission at all. Funny thing, Elias said carefully. She was never in territorial custody when I found her. She was half dead in an abandoned shack left there by her own people. Details. Morrison waved dismissively. The fact remains that she's wanted by lawful authority. You'll surrender her immediately or be charged as an accessory to her crimes. Nalnish, who had been following this exchange with growing understanding, suddenly spoke up. White Chief wants broken woman for himself, not for justice, for bounty money. That's enough from you, savage. Morrison snapped his mask of military courtesy, finally slipping. Your people have caused enough trouble in this territory. Time someone taught you proper respect for civilized authority. The word savage hung in the air like a curse, and Elias saw something shift in the Apache warriors' expressions. Whatever their feelings about Tina's betrayal of tribal law, they recognized a common enemy when they saw one. Seems to me, Elias said slowly, that the only savage here is the man who'd turn a wounded woman over to bounty hunters for profit. Morrison's face went red with rage. You're out of line, Ward. Just like you were out of line when you interfered with lawful military operations before. The difference is this time I don't need a court-martial to deal with you. His hand was fully on his pistol now, and several of his soldiers were raising their carbines. The situation was spiraling toward a three-way battle that would leave everyone dead and nobody's honor satisfied. That was when Tina surprised them all by rolling her wheelchair out of the barn, a rifle across her knees, and her voice carrying clearly across the tense silence. Enough, she said simply. All of you, enough. She looked first at Morrison, her dark eyes holding contempt that needed no translation. Blue Coat Colonel, you come here not for justice, but for gold. You see broken Apache woman as profit, nothing more. This make you lower than scavenger that feed on dead things. Morrison started to object, but she continued without pause, turning her attention to Nalnish. War chief of my people, you come here for honor but find only chance to spill more blood. How many Apache warriors die tonight for your pride? How many mothers lose sons because you cannot accept that some choices are bigger than tribal law? Finally, she looked at Elias and her expression softened with something that might have been love. Good man who protect when he could abandon, who fight when he could run. You offer your life for mine, but life without honor is not worth having, so I make choice that give honor to all. She raised the rifle, but instead of pointing it at any of the men surrounding her, she leveled it at her own chest. Apache women who die by own choice cannot be claimed by enemies, cannot be bounty for greedy soldiers or shame for angry warriors. I choose death with honor over life as prize to be won. Tina, no. Elias started toward her, but she shook her head firmly. Stay back, she commanded. This my choice to make, only choice that save everyone's honor. Wait, Nalnish said suddenly, his voice carrying an authority that stopped everyone in their tracks. He looked at Morrison with calculating eyes, then at his own warriors, then finally at Tina herself. There is another way, the war chief said slowly. Older way. Apache laws say that woman who find protector stronger than her own tribe has right to choose new people, right to be adopted into family that value her worth. He turned to Elias, his expression unreadable. White man, you fight with honor for what you protect. You spill blood, mine and yours, for woman others call worthless. This make you worthy of respect even from enemies. Morrison started to protest, but Nalnish continued as if the colonel didn't not exist. I declare blood debt between us settled. Woman, choose you as protector, you prove worthy of choice. She no longer Apache of my band. She become Apache of your band, your responsibility, your honor. That's not how territorial law works, Morrison blustered. She's still a wanted criminal regardless of whatever heathen ceremonies you perform. But it is how Apache law works, Tina said quietly, lowering the rifle. And Apache law is older than white man's law in this land. She looked at Elias with something approaching wonder. You accept responsibility for broken Apache woman, knowing it mean you also become outcast from your people. Elias didn't hesitate. I accepted that responsibility the day I carried you out of that shack. Everything since then has just been details. Nalnish nodded slowly, then spoke to his warriors in rapid Apache. They began to withdraw, melting back into the desert scrubland with the same ghostly silence that had marked their arrival. But before leaving, the war chief turned back to Elias. White man who fights with honor, he said formally. I give you warning. Blue coat chief has hunger in his eyes that will not be satisfied with gold. He will come back, bring more soldiers, find way to take woman for bounty. You must be ready. I'll be ready, Elias replied. Morrison watched the Apache withdrawal with barely concealed fury, his military formation looking suddenly small and inadequate in the vast emptiness of the desert. This isn't over, Ward, he said finally. Territorial authorities will hear about this, about your harboring of wanted criminals, your conspiracy with hostile Indians, your continued pattern of treason against lawful authority. You do what you think you have to do, Colonel, Elias said evenly. But remember, I know things about your military service that might not look good in an official report. Things about villages that were supposed to be under protection, about orders that were supposed to be humanitarian missions. Morrison's face went pale, and Elias knew his shot had hit home. The colonel had built his post-war career on carefully edited versions of his frontier service versions that didn't include massacres of peaceful Indians or the subordinate officers who'd tried to stop them. Mount up, Morrison ordered his men curtly. We're done here. As the cavalry column rode away, raising dust clouds that gradually faded into the morning haze, Elias found himself alone with Tina in the ruins of what had been his home. The barn still stood along with some of the outbuildings, but the house was a blackened shell that would need to be completely rebuilt. So, Tina said with a slight smile, now what we do? Elias looked around at the devastation, then at the woman who had cost him his home, but given him something infinitely more valuable, a purpose beyond mere survival, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. Now we build, he said simply. New house, new life, together. You not afraid? She asked. Morrison will come back like Naalnish say. Bring more soldiers, more trouble. Probably, Elias agreed. But trouble's nothing new for either of us, and this time we'll face it together. He helped her out of the wheelchair, supporting her weight, as they walked slowly toward the spring that provided water for the ranch. The morning sun was burning off the last of the storm clouds, revealing a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Tell me about this adoption ceremony, he said as they settled beside the water. What does it mean exactly? Tina considered the question carefully. Mean that you become my family and I become yours. Not husband and wife, different thing entirely. Deeper thing maybe. Mean that your honor and my honor are same honor. Your enemies are my enemies. Your battles are my battles. She paused, studying his face. You understand what you agree to. I understand that I've never had family before, Elias said quietly. Not real family. People who die for you and expect you to live for them. People who see your worth when the rest of the world sees only your failures. Then you understand, she said, reaching out to take his hand. Her grip was firm, calloused from hard work and harder living, but also gentle, with the promise of partnership freely chosen rather than imposed by circumstance. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the water flow from the spring in its eternal cycle of renewal. The ranch could be rebuilt, the burned timbers replaced, the damaged corrals repaired. But more than physical reconstruction lay ahead of them. They were building something that had never existed before in either of their lives. A family forged not by blood or law or tradition, but by choice and respect, and the kind of love that grows slowly between people who recognize their own strength reflected in each other's courage. "First thing," Tina said, practically breaking the contemplative mood, "we need shelter. Rain coming again soon, can smell it in air." Elias nodded, already mentally cataloging what materials had survived the fire and what they would need to acquire from town if the townspeople would even sell to them now. Morrison's threats weren't idle. There would be consequences for his choices, legal and social pressures that might make simple survival a daily struggle. But looking at Tina's determined expression, seeing the way she was already planning and plotting their reconstruction, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: anticipation of the future instead of mere endurance of the present. "Think we can get the barn converted into decent living quarters before winter?" he asked. "If we work together, yes," she replied confidently. Apache women know much about making comfortable homes from simple materials, and Apache women who have white man partners who actually listen to their advice can accomplish almost anything. The gentle teasing in her voice made him smile, a real smile, not the careful grimace he'd worn for so long that he'd forgotten what genuine happiness felt like. "Well then," he said, rising and offering her his arm for support, "I guess we better get started. Got a lot of work ahead of us, and winter won't wait for us to finish feeling sorry for ourselves." As they walked back toward the barn, Tina leaning on his strength, while he drew confidence from her determination, the sun climbed higher into the desert sky. Behind them, the spring continued its patient work of renewal, and ahead lay the promise of something neither of them had dared hope for just weeks before. A future built on the simple but revolutionary idea that two broken people might heal each other, and that love could grow in the harshest soil if it was tended by hands willing to do the work of building rather than destroying. The war was over. The real work of living was about to begin. 3 months after the fire, the Ward Ranch bore little resemblance to the modest spread it had been before Nalnish's warriors changed everything. What Elias and Tina had built together was something entirely new, not just a reconstruction of what had been lost, but a reimagining of what a home could be when designed by two people who understood both survival and hope. The barn had been transformed into living quarters that blended Apache practicality with frontier durability. Tina's knowledge of traditional construction techniques had guided modifications that made the space both comfortable and defensible. Windows were positioned to provide clear fields of fire while maximizing natural light. Interior walls created separate rooms without sacrificing the open flow that allowed her wheelchair-easy movement throughout the space. "Hand me those leather ties," Tina called from her position near the large loom Elias had built to her specifications. She was working on a blanket that combined Apache geometric patterns with colors that complemented their new home's interior, deep blues and earth tones that seemed to capture both desert sky and rich soil. Elias passed her the ties, pausing to admire her work. Over the months, he'd watched her fingers create beauty from the simplest materials, rugs that turned cold floors into inviting spaces, wall hangings that softened harsh adobe surfaces, clothing that was both practical and elegant. Her creativity seemed inexhaustible, as if the freedom to build rather than merely survive had unleashed artistic talents long suppressed by necessity. "Beautiful as always," he said, meaning it. "Flattery will not make me cook your supper faster," she replied with the mock seriousness that had become their comfortable rhythm of teasing. Wouldn't dream of rushing perfection. Elias grinned, settling into the chair beside her loom. Besides, I've got news from town that might affect our dinner plans anyway. Tina's hands stilled on the weaving, her expression growing alert. News from town was rarely simple. Their situation had made them objects of curiosity, suspicion, and in some cases active hostility among the territorial settlers. Good news or bad news, she asked. Bit of both, I reckon. Elias stretched his legs, feeling the familiar ache in his old injury that always preceded weather changes. Doc Harrison says Mrs. Patterson delivered her baby safe and sound yesterday. Boy, about 8 pounds, healthy as a horse. That is good news. Tina smiled genuinely. She was worried about complications, yes, being older for first baby. 38 and scared half to death, Elias confirmed. But Doc says everything went perfect. Even better news is that she specifically asked him to thank you for the birthing tea you prepared. Said it made all the difference during the labor. Over the past months, Tina's knowledge of traditional Apache medicine had gradually earned respect among some of the town's women. Her preparations for everything from difficult births to childhood fevers had proven effective enough that even the most prejudiced settlers occasionally swallowed their pride and requested her help. And the bad news? Tina asked, because she knew him well enough to read the tension that remained in his posture. Morrison's back, Elias said simply. Rode in this morning with a dozen soldiers and some kind of federal marshal. They're asking questions about you, about us, about what happened during the attack. Tina's expression didn't change, but he saw her shoulders square with the unconscious straightening that meant she was preparing for battle. They'd both known this day would come. Morrison wasn't the type of man to forget perceived slights or abandon potential profits. What kind of questions? She asked. The kind that suggest he's building a case for harboring fugitive criminals, Elias replied. Seems he's been busy back east talking to territorial officials about the dangers of allowing hostile Indians to remain at large in settled areas. I am not hostile Indian, Tina said with quiet dignity. I am Apache woman who choose different path than war chiefs demand. There is difference. You and I know that, Elias agreed. Question is whether a federal marshal and a territorial judge will see it the same way. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving at a deliberate pace rather than the urgent gallop that usually signaled immediate trouble. Elias reached automatically for his rifle, but Tina's hand on his arm stopped him. Wait, she said, listening intently to sounds he couldn't distinguish. These not soldiers. Different horses, different way of riding. She was right, as she usually was about such things. The riders who emerged from the desert heat shimmer were civilians, 3 men and a woman, all dressed in the practical clothing of working ranchers, rather than military uniforms or town finery. The lead rider was Tom Bradford, whose spread lay about 20 miles southwest of Elias's place. Behind him rode his wife Sarah, their grown son Michael, and a man Elias recognized as Jim Corrigan, whose family had been among the settlers Tina had warned about Naelnish's planned attack. Afternoon, Elias, Bradford called as he dismounted. Mind if we water our horses? Been riding hard in this heat. Course not, Elias replied, gesturing toward the trough near the well. Tina, maybe you could bring some cool water for our guests, too. As Tina wheeled herself toward the house, Bradford approached with the deliberate manner of a man who had something important to say, but wasn't sure how to begin. Heard Morrison's in town, he said without preamble. Word travels fast, Elias observed. Bad news always does, Sarah Bradford interjected, accepting a cup of water from Tina with a grateful nod. Question is, what are we going to do about it? The question hung in the air like dust from the horse's hooves. Elias studied the 4 faces before him, looking for clues about their intentions. These weren't social visitors. They'd ridden too far in too much heat for casual conversation. Depends what you mean by we, he said carefully. Jim Corrigan stepped forward, his weathered face serious but not unfriendly. Means we've been talking those of us who remember what really happened during the Apache troubles, who remember which side you both were on when it mattered. Some folks in town got short memories, Michael Bradford added. Like to forget that it was Tina's warning that saved my family and a dozen others when Nalnish's war party came calling. They forget because it's convenient, Sarah said bluntly. Easier to paint all Apaches as savages than admit that sometimes it's white men who act like animals. Elias felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. For months, he'd prepared himself for the possibility that they'd face whatever was coming entirely alone. The idea that others remembered that others might be willing to stand with them was almost overwhelming. Appreciate the sentiment, he said quietly. But Morrison's got federal backing this time, different situation than dealing with local prejudice. Maybe, Corrigan said, but federal law works both ways. Territories got rights too, and so do territorial citizens. Been doing some reading on this subject, talking to a lawyer friend down in Tucson. He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. Turns out there's legal precedent for what you two did. Something called humanitarian exception to fugitive laws. Says that giving aid to wounded individuals doesn't constitute harboring criminals if the aid is provided on humanitarian grounds without knowledge of criminal activity. Tina looked up from her wheelchair, hope flickering in her dark eyes. What does this mean exactly? Means we get enough people willing to testify that you were dying when Elias found you, that you were helped purely for humanitarian reasons, and that your actions since then have been those of a peaceful member of the community. Well, Morrison's case gets a lot harder to prove. And you'd be willing to testify to all that? Elias asked. Hell yes, Bradford said emphatically. Sarah and me, we owe our lives to what Tina did. Not about to forget that just because some ambitious colonel wants to make political points. Same here, Corrigan nodded. My youngest daughter is alive today because of the warning we got. Far as I'm concerned, that makes Tina family, and you don't abandon family just because times get difficult. Over the next 2 hours, as the afternoon heat began to fade toward evening, the 4 visitors laid out a plan that was both ambitious and dangerous. They'd been organizing quietly for weeks, gathering statements from settlers who'd been helped by Tina's medical knowledge, ranchers who'd benefited from her advice about dealing with the land, and families who remembered her role in preventing the massacre that Nalnish had planned. Got 23 sworn statements so far, Sarah Bradford explained, and more coming in every day. Doc Harrison's prepared to testify about your medical skills, Tina. Says some of your treatments work better than anything in his medicine bag. Judge Patterson's been asking questions too, Michael added, quiet-like, but word is he's not entirely convinced that Morrison's version of events tells the whole story. The plan they outlined was risky. Essentially, they were proposing to challenge federal authority using territorial law and public sentiment. If it worked, Morrison would find himself facing a united community rather than isolated individuals he could intimidate or marginalize. If it fails, we're all in trouble, Elias said, voicing what everyone was thinking. Morrison's not the type to forget who opposed him. Maybe, Corrigan agreed, but seems to me we're already in trouble. Question is whether we face it together or separately. After their visitors departed, promising to continue their efforts while advising extreme caution, Elias and Tina sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of coral and gold. The beauty of the evening seemed almost surreal given the weight of the decisions they faced. You think it will work? Tina asked quietly. This plan of theirs might, Elias replied honestly. Depends on how much political pressure Morrison can bring to bear and whether Judge Patterson is more interested in justice or career advancement. And if it does not work? Elias was quiet for a long moment, considering their options. Then we run, he said finally. Head south into Mexico or north into Colorado territory. Start over somewhere Morrison's influence doesn't reach. Leave all this. Tina gestured at the ranch they'd built together, the home that represented the first real stability either of them had known in years. If we have to, he confirmed, but I'd rather fight for what we've built here if there's any chance of winning. Then we fight, she said with the calm certainty that he'd come to associate with her most important decisions. Together, like everything else. The next morning brought visitors of a different sort. Morrison arrived with his federal marshal and a small escort of soldiers, their blue uniforms marking them as representatives of authority that brooked no compromise or negotiation. Ward, Morrison called from his horse, not bothering to dismount. I have here a federal warrant for the arrest of the Apache woman known as Tina, wanted on charges of murder conspiracy against territorial settlers and violation of federal treaties. What murder? Elias asked, stepping onto his porch with his rifle held casually but ready. What conspiracy? Be specific, Colonel. The murder of cavalry trooper Benjamin Hayes during the attack on the Millstone settlement, the marshal replied, consulting his documents. The conspiracy to provide intelligence to hostile Apache forces, the violation of federal treaties requiring all Apache to remain on designated reservations. Each charge was delivered with bureaucratic precision, but Elias could hear the weakness beneath the official language. These were charges constructed to fit a predetermined conclusion rather than accusations based on solid evidence. Trooper Hayes was killed during a battle, Tina called from inside the house, her voice carrying clearly through the open door. Battle that happened because white soldiers attacked peaceful Apache camp without warning. I defend myself and my people, that not murder under any law, white or Apache. Apache woman doesn't get to decide what constitutes lawful military action, Morrison snapped, and she certainly doesn't get to provide aid and comfort to enemies of the United States. Funny thing about that, Elias said conversationally. Seems to me I recall a certain colonel who provided aid and comfort to his own enemies during the war. Something about selling cavalry supplies to Confederate raiders in exchange for information about Union troop movements. Morrison's face went white, then red with fury. You're talking about classified military operations that were authorized at the highest levels. Authorized by who? Elias pressed. Because I've got documentation that suggests those operations were completely unauthorized, conducted for personal profit rather than military necessity. The federal marshal looked back and forth between them, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Gentlemen, we're here to execute a lawful warrant, not to relitigate past military actions. Course you are, Elias agreed. Question is, you sure that warrant's as lawful as it appears? That was when Tom Bradford and his group appeared on the horizon, riding hard toward the ranch. Behind them came more riders, dozens of them, representing nearly every family within 50 miles. They spread out in a loose semicircle around Morrison's small force, not threatening but clearly indicating that any action against Tina would have to be taken in full view of the territorial community. What the hell is this? Morrison demanded. This is a territorial hearing, Judge Patterson announced, riding up with a small group that included Doc Harrison and two men Elias didn't recognize. Called at the request of concerned citizens who have questions about the validity of federal charges against a member of their community. You have no authority to interfere with federal law enforcement, Morrison protested. Actually, I do, Patterson replied mildly. Territorial judges have broad discretionary powers in cases involving disputed jurisdiction between federal and territorial authority, especially when questions arise about the accuracy of charges or the proper application of federal law. What followed was unlike anything Elias had ever witnessed, a combination of legal hearing, community meeting, and public trial conducted in the open air of his ranch yard. Judge Patterson established himself behind a makeshift table while Morrison and his marshal conferred urgently about their legal options. The testimony began with Jim Corrigan's account of Nalnish's planned attack and Tina's warning that had saved multiple families. His words were followed by similar accounts from other settlers, creating a picture of someone who had consistently chosen protection of innocence over loyalty to her own tribe. Doc Harrison testified about her medical knowledge and the lives she'd helped save through traditional healing methods. Sarah Bradford spoke about the birthing tea that had eased her difficult labor. Michael Bradford described how her advice about water management had helped their family survive the previous year's drought. "Point of order," Morrison interrupted during Sarah's testimony. "None of this changes the fact that the defendant is a wanted fugitive who violated federal treaty obligations." "Actually, Colonel," Judge Patterson replied, "it changes everything. Federal law requires that charges be based on evidence of actual criminal activity, not political convenience or personal animosity. The evidence is clear. The evidence is contradictory at best." Patterson cut him off. "What I'm hearing from territorial citizens is testimony about humanitarian actions, community service, and peaceful integration. What I'm seeing from federal authorities is accusations without corroboration and charges that seem designed to fit a predetermined narrative." The hearing continued for hours with witness after witness testifying to Tina's character and contributions to the community. Through it all, she sat in her wheelchair beside Elias, her dignity intact despite the weight of accusations and legal jeopardy. When it came time for her to speak on her own behalf, she wheeled herself forward to face Judge Patterson directly. "Your Honor." She began, her English clear and precise, despite the obvious emotion in her voice. "I am an Apache woman who choose different path than my people demand. I choose to protect innocent life instead of taking it. I choose to heal instead of harm. I choose to build instead of destroy." She paused, looking around at the assembled crowd. "These choices cost me everything among my own people, family, tribe, even ability to walk. But they give me something more valuable, clean conscience and new family who value same things I value." She turned slightly to include Elias in her gaze. "This man find me dying and choose to save me when he could have left me to die. He protect me when he could have abandoned me to enemies. He give me chance to become more than broken victim of other people's hatred." Her voice grew stronger. "If this make us criminals, then we are criminals who choose love over hate, healing over violence, building over destroying. I accept whatever punishment you think this deserves, but I will never apologize for choosing compassion over revenge." The silence that followed her words was profound, not empty, but full of the kind of reverent hush that accompanies moments when fundamental truths are spoken with absolute clarity. Judge Patterson was the first to break the silence. "Marshal Williams," he said, addressing the federal officers who were, "in light of the testimony presented here today and given the substantial questions raised about the accuracy and motivation behind these charges, I'm dismissing the federal warrant as lacking sufficient evidence of actual criminal activity." Morrison shot to his feet. "You exceed your authority, Judge. Federal warrants cannot be dismissed by territorial courts." "Actually, they can," Patterson replied calmly, "when those warrants are based on false or insufficient evidence. Federal law requires proper evidentiary support for criminal charges, and that support is clearly lacking in this case." "This isn't over," Morrison warned, his face dark with rage. "I'll appeal this to higher authorities. I'll have your decision overturned and your jurisdiction revoked." "You're welcome to try," Patterson said mildly, "but I'd recommend you focus your efforts on actual criminal activity rather than persecuting people whose only crime is choosing mercy over vengeance." As Morrison and his reduced forces prepared to depart, Tom Bradford approached Elias and Tina with something approaching ceremony. "Wanted to make this official," he said, pulling out another document. "We've been talking, all of us whose families you helped save. We'd like to offer you both full membership in the Territorial Settlers Association, voting rights representation on the council, the works. What's that mean exactly? Elias asked. Means you're not outsiders anymore, Sarah Bradford explained. Means you're full members of this community with all the rights and protections that come with it. Means the next time someone like Morrison tries to cause trouble, he'll have to go through all of us to get to you. Tina looked up at Elias, her eyes bright with tears she didn't try to hide. We have family now, she said softly. Real family, choose freely given instead of demanded by blood or law. As the crowd began to disperse and normal life gradually resumed its rhythm, Elias found himself sitting on his porch with Tina as the sun set over their valley. The day had changed everything and nothing. They were still the same people, still facing the same challenges of building a life together in harsh country, but now they faced those challenges as acknowledged members of a community rather than isolated outcasts. So, Tina said, eventually her voice carrying the contentment that had become one of his favorite sounds. What do we do now? Elias considered the question, looking out over the land they'd claimed, and the home they'd built, and the community they'd earned through courage and compassion. Now we live, he said simply. We keep building, keep growing, keep choosing love over fear and hope over despair. Together, together, he confirmed, reaching over to take her hand, always together. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, two people who had been broken by their separate pasts sat in comfortable silence, drawing strength from their shared present and looking forward to whatever future they would build with their own hands and hearts. The desert wind sang its ancient song around them, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of rain. And in that wind, if you listened carefully, you could hear something new, not the lonely cry of isolated souls, but the quiet harmony of two people who had found in each other not just love, but home. The first man, who didn't hurt her, had become something more than protector or partner. He had become family, chosen freely and held close by bonds stronger than blood or law or tradition. And in a land where survival was never guaranteed and kindness was often seen as weakness, they had built something that would endure, not because it was protected by walls or weapons, but because it was founded on the simple but revolutionary idea that broken people could heal each other, and that love, once planted in willing hearts, could grow strong enough to weather any storm the world might send their way.